Hello, this is a recording for the Suffolk Jungian Circle, and as per usual, if anybody else is interested in Jungian topics, of course, you're more than welcome to follow along and comment, ask questions, whatever. The November meeting of the Circle will be an online discussion of Carl Jung's theories as they are applied to the Star Wars films. So this is a supportive waffle to get people started thinking about those issues. I'm only going to think about the original three films that were put out in my childhood, largely because I haven't bothered following the more recent additions to the genre. They just haven't really appealed to me. I really did like the first three, but the more recent ones just haven't grabbed my attention. So I'm not going to attempt to apply the ideas to those, although I'm sure there must be plenty of mileage in doing so. Um, I thought it might be worth starting with a mention from a Jungian called Botha, who picked up, and I'm sure George Lucas, the writer, producer, director, whatever he is, who created the original Star Wars films, is somewhere on record saying that he was very inspired by Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, and of course Joseph Campbell was very inspired by Jung. So there is a direct or possibly slightly indirect impact of Jungian ideas on the creation of the script, and no doubt Lucas, those ideas were via Lucas permeating into things like casting choices, special effects, costuming, all sorts of other stuff as well. Um, and it strikes me that one of the things that Bota adds, it strikes me as being quite plausible as an argument, is the success of Star Wars, which has made umpty millions of pounds since its inception, is in no small part down to the fact that Lucas based his plot lines and so on Jungian concepts. He was creating a myth, or recreating, we could say, an ancient myth, but setting it in a space age. But nonetheless, the figures and the storylines, the plots, etc., unfold in a way that is recognisable to students of ancient myth, and that perhaps the same could be said of Tolkien, the same could be said of J.K. Rowling's, that in creating these phenomenally successful fantasies, part of the appeal is that they rework ancient stories, and there is this deep rooted need in the human psyche, not just for what Jung refers to as the God shaped whole, but we could say the mythology shaped whole. This yearning for as people maybe become more distanced from the myths of their distant ancestors, that they crave new versions of the same thing, and so they're turning to cinema, they're turning to literature, they're turning to other outlets to provide them with the same kind of stories but repackaged in a different format. So instead of winged horses and flying carpets, there are spaceships, but the underlying plot is the same. And I think that is perhaps worth bearing in mind, and certainly for anyone who hopes to make it big in cinema or in literature, recycle mythology. There you go, that's the key advice from all of this. So where to begin? In Star Wars, I think there is a bit of an ambiguity going on, it seems to me, and as I was jotting down ideas for this, I realised how long it is since I've actually seen those films. And so I'm sure there's lots of elements of those films that have just fallen out of my memory, but hopefully in the discussions other people will remember things that I've forgotten and kind of key them in to Jungian concepts. But there's a tension, I think, between the characters of Luke Skywalker and Han Solo, which reminds me of Jung's idea of the warring brothers, of these various ancient stories of invariably two brothers who are very different from each other, kind of polar opposites, and sometimes it's an outright war, hands around the throat trying to kill each other, as in Egyptian mythology, for example, or the biblical tale of Cain and Abel. Other times it's more non-murderous tension, shall we say, and I think that's what we've got here in Star Wars. because obviously Han Solo and Skywalker are not trying to murder each other. They are just very different characters, and between them they form two halves of the heroic whole. So you got Luke as more the kind of pure Eternus, the eternal child, the innocent farm boy from a backwater planet who has got no idea that he has all of this kind of forces gathering around him, this destiny linked to who his father is and everything else. And that again is a common theme. Lots of myths of heroic characters who discover relatives they didn't even know existed as the adventure rolls on and find out that they are linked to royalty or some other kind of grand fate like Harry Potter, and kind of has a great destiny ahead of him. So that is a not uncommon theme, and I suppose part of the appeal there at a human level as well as the grandiose myth is that most of us have really quite ordinary humdrum lives. We are the farm boys or farm girls from backwater communities where nothing very much ever happens. And there is this deep rooted yearning for a bit of excitement, a bit of drama, a bit of meaning, to discover that you're important, that you're not just some hick who can be born and live and die and nobody whatsoever notices or cares. This yearning for role, for position, for meaning, for significance, that life is not just you're born, you live, you die, end of, that there is something more to it than that. And of course, what Skywalker is discovering, and the other characters, is their significance, their place in the universe, that they are not irrelevant, that they're not background characters, that they are figures with meaning and importance to them, with stories that will play a great role, not only in their own lives, but in the lives of numerous other people as well. So anyway, back to the plot. Skywalker is the innocent, the unworldly, the naive character, the pure Eternus, the childlike character, and even by the end of the first three films, he's still quite innocent, quite sort of sweet and unworldly and naive. Whereas Han Solo, by contrast, of course, is much more like the trickster archetype. He's the wisecracking, worldly, cynical, been there, seen it, done it, got the T-shirt, doesn't trust anyone character. And there's an interesting kind of sexual dynamic. I don't mean the kind of gay dynamic or anything going on between the two male characters, but rather there's the almost asexual romance going on between Skywalker and Princess Leia, which of course cannot be consummated because, as we discover by the end of the film, they are siblings, and it would be kind of unbelievably revolting if they'd ever gone further than gazing wistfully at each other when they had no idea that they were related to each other. Whereas Leia's fundamental attraction ultimately is to the worldly, the wisecracking, the much more sexualized character of Han Solo, who's got much excuse me, more of the male swagger to him rather than the sort of boyish charm of Luke. And so you've got two elements going on there of male sexuality, I think, in those two characters. The boyish innocence of Luke and the much more mature, worldly, macho kind of quality going on with Han Solo. And that between them they are the two halves of a male psyche rather than two completely distinct characters. And Princess Leia obviously can tie into the anima, the feminine part of the psyche. She is more drawn to one than she is to the other. There's been all sorts of weird and wonderful studies done psychologically about the kinds of men that women find attractive at different stages in their lives. And Solo has got that kind of bad boy vibe going on about him. Although, of course, he is not actually morally bad. He's not an evil person. He may be bitter and cynical, but he's not going to torture and murder and rape and do God knows what else. So his badness is very kind of low key, mild naughtiness rather than outright badness. But then again, initially it was intended as largely as a sort of children's film to appeal to a young audience, so they couldn't go too graphic in their sense of malice and evil. Speaking of which, of course, you've got the Empire itself as the force of evil, the collective force of evil. Um, and you've got various sinister characters going on, the primary one of which is Darth Vader, the Dark Father, from an archetypal point of view, because he is, of course, Luke's father, but he is also this embodiment of wickedness and corruption that he's sort of halfway between the father archetype and the Senex archetype, although Jung does say those two are very closely interrelated to each other, because he is the dark wizard, as it were, the dark Senex, the dark sage, who stands in contrast to the bright wizard of Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first film, and later on Yoda becomes the wizardy character, the benevolent wizardly character that fills the shoes that Obi-Wan Kenobi has emptied when he gets killed off. And there, of course, again is a significant turning point, because like Gandalf, who dies and becomes greater after death, and of course Rowling's reworks that idea with Dumbledore dying off, and then, well, he doesn't kind of become greater after death in that sense, but he becomes this guiding figure even in death, that he is in communication with Harry Potter, in that scene that's set in the ghostly railway station, the afterlife railway station. So he kind of does a Gandalf type of comeback, sort of. And likewise, Obi-Wan Kenobi, even when he's dead, is not completely dead. He's still sort of hovering around in the background as a spiritual presence. So you've got the benevolent wizard, who is also a bit of a father figure to Luke, and you've got the dark wizard, who is the force of corruption, and Vader, very much like Satan in early Christian myth and Shamael in Judaic story, is the tempter. Yes, he is killing people and doing his death grip, killing people off with his mystic powers, and participating in the invasion of planets and blowing up of planets and doing Lord knows what else on a grand scale. But I think his main role in the story really is this idea of him trying to lure Luke into the dark side. So he's not putting a gun to his head, or indeed a lightsaber to his head and forcing him into the dark side. It's temptation. Come with me, join with me, which is, of course, what Satan does in Christian myth. He doesn't make people do terrible things. He rather stands at their shoulder and whispers in their ear, "No one would know if you did," and tries to corrupt people into doing things of their own volition, which are dreadful and awful. And Vader is in that kind of a role. Except, of course, there's a bit of a spin in that ultimately Vader goes over to the bright side rather than the dark side. And so he is, when the evil Palpatine, the evil Emperor, is about to murder off Luke entirely, it's Vader who switches sides and intervenes, and is not prepared to see the death of his child. He's quite willing to see the corruption of his child to bring the boy over to the side of the Empire, but he is not willing to see him killed outright. And so that sort of sacrificial element, which to some extent I suppose echoes the story of Abraham and Isaac. Will he sacrifice his child? Will he not? Well, kind of echoes it anyway, to a point. Becomes a crux in the redemption arc for Vader, which itself is quite interesting. That you've got the hero's journey centered around Luke. He comes from this backwater planet. He goes off. He meets all these exciting friends and strange mad characters, including Chewbacca, who is a bit like all those folklore talking animals, except of course, well, I suppose Chewbacca talks in Chewbacca language, but he doesn't talk in a language that anybody other than Han Solo can actually understand. So a bit like Dick Whittington's cat, or the Iron Wolf, or the various talking foxes and things like that appear in many legends. He is the animal character who Jung says relates to the or was it the tertiary function? He talks about the you've got the prime function, which is the hero, which would be Luke. The weakest function, which becomes Darth Vader, the dark force, the corrupt force, and then the two side forces, one of which is an ally, which would be, I suppose, Han Solo. The other is the slightly less developed, slightly weaker trait, which becomes the friendly talking animal, which should be listened to for advice and guidance on the journey. So you've got those kind of characters going on in Skywalker's journey. But you've also got the redemption story of Vader, as he goes from being a very grim character at the start of the story to eventually, 3 films down the line, becoming a more fatherly character and sacrificing his own life to protect his son and being redeemed in that final act of self-immolation as he stands up against the truly corrupt and unredeemable force of evil that is embodied in the Emperor himself, the one who is beyond salvation, which is of course why he dies. He doesn't get redeemed, he dies. So you've got those various kind of interactions going on there. There's also echoes of other stories. So that the part in the 3rd film where Luke is battling his father, which itself is quite Freudian in many respects. The clash between father and son as the son gets older and is coming into his own power and is no longer in the submissive role, is no longer the little boy but is becoming the man. And there is a sort of renegotiation of power, at least in the family level, if not necessarily in the Star Wars level, between Luke and Darth Vader. But part of that, of course, involves the clash where they're having their lightsaber battle, and Luke's hand gets chopped off and eventually replaced by a mechanical hand, which is a direct... Well, I assume George Lucas must have read it. I don't know for a fact that he has, but the Irish story of Nuatha, who gets his hand cut off in battle with Shreng, the leader of the Verbolg, the enemy people that the gods are clashing with, and has to abdicate in Irish myth. He can no longer serve as king because he is maimed, but his hand is replaced with a silver one, a fully functioning, fully articulate silver hand. So an ancient Irish version of cybernetics, basically, very much like Luke getting his mechanical hand in the story. Eventually, of course, in the Irish myth, Nuatha's real hand is reattached to the stump, and he's restored to wholeness again, which doesn't happen in Star Wars. He just gets the mechanical hand. He doesn't get his real one glued back on, as it were. So I assume Lucas must have read that Irish myth story, or at least heard of it at any rate, and incorporated elements of that. It does echo to other stories of hand loss, like Tu in Norse myth getting his hand bitten off by Fenrir Wolf. But again, I suppose both stories, the Irish and the Norse story, it is an upholder of law and social order and cosmic harmony and justice that is willing to put itself in harm's way, either putting a hand in the mouth of the giant wolf or going up against this terrible king of a rival army and going into battle with all the swords swinging and hacking and slashing and what have you. And so the loss of the hand can be understood in all sorts of ways, but it is emblematic of sacrifice, the willingness to give up something, to risk being harmed, to risk being hurt, in order to maintain harmony for the benefit of others. And it is the role of ancient kings, I'm not sure about modern day ones, but of ancient kings to put themselves in harm's way for the benefit of their people. And yes, they may lose an arm or a leg or some other bodily part in the battle against the forces of chaos and disorder, but they're willing to do so for the greater good of others. And that is kind of what Luke is doing. He is putting himself in harm's way to defeat the evil empire and bring about freedom and liberty for all of the oppressed peoples who are conquered and colonised and what have you. It is a bit of an early anti-colonial thing going on there, in this idea that the empire is a monstrous force rather than the kind of old Victorian empire building notions that empire is bringing civilization to the far flung simplistic cultures of the world. Rather it's seeing that imperialism as a terrible thing rather than as a benevolent thing. So it's coming from a very distinct political slant on that one. Going back to Luke and Han Solo, as well as the innocent child archetype versus the trickster archetype, you could also see this as a duality between introvert and extrovert, shy, retiring Luke, and loud, brash Han Solo are in tension with each other on that basis, as well as the other kind of patterns and distinctions between them. So you've got all of that going on. I've mentioned Yoda already as an expression of the wise old sage, the Senex archetype. That Yoda lives on this rather swampy planet, and when Luke's ship lands there, it sinks into the mud, and Yoda has to levitate it out a bit later on in the film. You could take that swamp planet as a metaphor for the unconscious mind, and as the spaceship shuttle lands on the planet, sinks into the muck, that as we engage with the unconsciousness, we often lose things. Perhaps especially our sense of being able to escape from it, which of course the ship embodies. It's the ability not only to arrive there in the first place on the planet, but the power to leave it again later on. And maybe when we're first engaging with the murky swamp of our own unconscious minds, we start to feel as if we're going to be kind of sucked into the swamp and drawn down into the quicksand, never to escape again. But the capacity to escape is in the hands of the Senex archetype, that brings its wisdom, its knowledge, its power, and with wisdom comes the power to do things like levitate spaceships, that will provide the ability to depart from the unconscious swamp when the time is right, when all of the necessary lessons have been learnt at the foot of the master, and the student is wise enough and clever enough and has absorbed enough of the knowledge that they can then go back out into the world and tackle the world, and not spend all day staring up their own fundament and studying the mysteries of their own unconscious minds and their murky memories. But there's an element of that going on. I suppose in the same way you could take Tatooine, the home planet that Luke lives on with his aunt and uncle, who I suppose you could see as father-mother archetypes, but they're very kind of minor figures in the story. They're in it for about 5 minutes and then they get killed off. So they're not desperately significant, I don't think, from an archetypal point of view. But Tatooine is a very arid planet. It's a very dry, deserty, dusty planet. So in contrast to the swamp planet of Yoda, it's that dryness, that dust could be seen as a sort of an arid mental environment to live in, one that's not productive of imagination, of dreams, of thoughts, of hopes, of ambitions, and the expectation, I suppose, from the aunt and uncle that Luke will grow up to run the farm and not want to do anything else except continue doing what they did, and presumably their parents before them and their parents before them, and that kind of continuation of small-scale life. So it's not the kind of environment that is fertile for ambition and dreaming and grasping at a universe beyond the immediate limits of I was going to say picket fence. I'm not sure that's quite the right image for a desert planet, but never mind. but in contrast to the murkiness and the dampness of Yoda's home planet. So that's two sorts of metaphorical environments going on there, I suppose. And perhaps in the same sense of archetype and metaphor, the Death Star itself as a created world rather than a natural world. It's entirely artificial. Puts me in mind a little bit of Max Weber's notion of the iron cage, of the artificially made world that traps people inside it. So Max Weber is thinking more in context of suffocating employment conditions and things like that, rather than of actual microchips and plastic and all the rest of it, which of course weren't a thing in Max Weber's lifetime. Well, not microchips anyway. But the aridity of the Death Star echoes the aridity of Tatooine, but is much, much worse. And it's kind of an underworld metaphor. This is the place of death, the Death Star, the place of destruction, of all things being ended. And obviously the Death Star blows up planets. It blows up Princess Leia's planet. It does all sorts of terrible, nasty things, and it's the goal of the first film is to destroy the Death Star, to get rid of it, which you could take in a number of capacities, that it is coming to terms with our own destructiveness, because of course we go back to that Jungian idea that all of the characters are different aspects of the same person. They're not actually separate people, they're all different parts of the same being, if you like, so that including places as well as characters, so that the Death Star and the Grand Moff Tarkin and the whole kind of Imperial army that runs the Death Star and builds the Death Star is obviously it's a direct metaphor for the Nazis. They're all in that kind of slightly Nazi-ish looking uniform that they're marching around in. It's an industrial complex that reduces all human life to a mechanistic level, and that's again very much what Max Weber was talking about with his idea of the iron cage, this kind of soul-sucking social system that traps people within it and squashes out the dreams and the hopes and the imagination and the love and the passions and the yearning, until everyone just drudges and drudges and drudges and obeys and does as they're told and pays their taxes and lives these dreary, dull lives where they never rebel. And of course you've got the Rebel Alliance, which is the good guys in the film, the ones who are rebelling against the soul-sucking mechanistic universe that the evil empire is trying to force everybody into. Because it's not just about obedience because there's a gun in your face, and doing as you're told but only as long as there's a gun in your face, or a laser gun, or whatever. It's for Weber, it's internalizing mental conditions so that the downtrodden, the people whose souls have been squeezed out of them, never even dream of rebelling, never even believe it is capable to rebel, it's possible to rebel. There is no alternative but the drudgery. And if you can, from a kind of evil tyrannical point of view, if you can condition your citizens, your slaves, I suppose would be probably a more appropriate term than citizens, because that implies that they've got some kind of status if you're a citizen, and in the evil empire they don't have status. If you can condition them to the point where you don't need to even point the laser beam, the gun, the death ray at them, they'll just do as they're told because you have crushed the life out of them and they become meekly obedient. And each generation of sprogs raised within that family environment becomes just as obedient. So you don't need to be carting people off to gulags and death camps and God knows what. After a while, they'll just raise subsequent generations with the same level of meek obedience that they have. The same notion that there is no alternative but to obey. Then the evil empire, the tyrant, as an archetype has succeeded, because the tyrant's power relies not so much on beating people up, but on conditioning them to not struggle anymore, to submit, to do as they're told, meekly, obediently, without any hope of any alternative, but to lick the boots of the tyrant and do as they're damn well told, in a sense. And I think that's a strong feature of the Star Wars films, the first few of them at any rate, is the clash between the culture of the Empire that wants absolute slavish obedience and doesn't really give a damn about anyone except in as much as they're a moderately useful cog in the machine. And as soon as they stop being useful as a cog in the machine, or they get a bit shirty or a bit rebellious or whatever, get rid of them, replace them. And the Rebel Alliance, who, whilst they're chaotic and disorganised and don't know what they're doing from one minute to the next half the time, are yearning for freedom, are yearning to dream, are yearning to have possibilities in their lives other than mindless obedience to the tyrant. And it's that kind of, the duality between obedience and freedom is an underlying theme there, an archetypal theme. So Luke's journey, his hero's journey, is to embrace the possibility of freedom for himself, and of course, in a knock-on domino fashion, it brings freedom for other people as well. The power to dream, the power to choose your own life rather than just do as you're damn well told all the time. Vader's redemption arc is to go from being a full supporter of tyranny to eventually seeing the terrible cost of tyranny when his own son's life is on the line, and refuse to participate anymore. So even though Vader's act of rebellion is right at the very end of his life, and it's a very kind of a brief moment of rebellion after a lifetime of service to tyranny, it's nonetheless a critical rebellion, a critical turning point for him, and for Luke, of course, because it saves his life, and helps to end the Empire, brings down the wicked Emperor himself, and lobs him off that great turret, and he falls into oblivion down below. Which is a very suitable one. The fall from great height, both metaphorically as the political power, so he goes from great power at the top of society to being a splattered mess on the floor. But also the fall down is a journey into darkness. It's the catabasis, the journey into the underworld, that the Emperor is being lobbed down to hell, down into darkness to splatter, where he will be an irrelevance, a ghost amongst the other powerless shades in the underworld, stripped of all of his might and power and tyranny that he's enjoyed for far too long. And that may be part of the reason why they put all that latex on the actor, to make him look so ugly and so awful, as if he's sort of so incredibly old, he's just shriveled up to a walnut practically, to emphasise this idea of someone clinging on way beyond their due time, because they enjoy their power and their tyranny and maybe fear the alternative of what's waiting for them in the underworld. So they cling on and cling on and cling on, and he gets wrinklier and wrinklier and wrinklier and looks more and more ghastly and awful, rather than letting go at an appropriate time to depart. Which, to some extent, Vader is himself going down that line, with all of his kind of breathing apparatus and his life support machines that keep him alive, even though he clearly should have been dead a long time ago. He is also, like the Emperor, clinging on way beyond the point when he should have passed beyond and let go. And there's a bit of a moral lesson there that Vader could have become the next Emperor. He could have become just as monstrous as the old one, but at the crucial moment in the film, he does let go. He takes the Emperor with him as they go off the balcony and down into oblivion. So there's strong elements of that going on there. I think I probably waffled on sufficiently for this. enough hopefully to get discussion going in the November group. So if you would like to have the link to the Teams meeting, do leave an email on the blog or on the YouTube page, and I will send you the link if you would like to participate. It's the final Wednesday in November in 7:30 in the evening for an hour and a half if you want to join in. Okay, enjoy and hopefully see you there. Bye bye.